think we could say good afternoon, right? So we'll shift gears and move this panel. This is going to be an interesting panel because I think the first panel did a nice job at talking about the state of the industry. I think we're going to shift and talk about kind of restoring hope or continuing the hope for those with rare disease in the context of policy and regulatory reforms. So I'm excited to have a great panel here that can represent those views and perspectives, and certainly welcome and recommend questions from the audience as we move throughout the discussion. But first, maybe I'll ask our esteemed panel here to introduce yourself and just give a little bit of background, and then we can move into the heart of the discussion.
Okay, I am Tim Cote. I'm a physician. I spent most of my career working for the federal government and was the director of the Office of Orphan Products from the period that ended in 2011. Subsequent to that, I became a consultant. It grew very rapidly and was sold to IQVIA in 2017, thus beginning a non-compete period of 4 years where I grew some great tomatoes. And following that, I restarted in Kendall Square, the center of the universe for biotech, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. About a year ago, we've restarted and are doing consulting activities.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you today. My name is Heidi Ross. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the National Organization for Rare Disorders. My background is in global and domestic health policy. I was a Hill staffer for about 8 years and then went to a global health NGO. And then about 2.5 years ago, came back to domestic health and I'm at NORD. So thank you very much for having me.
Hi, I'm Katie Miller. I am a health economist at FDA in the Office of Orphan Products Development. I've been at FDA almost a decade now, and I study incentives for rare disease drug development.
All right, good stuff. I think what we'll do to start the conversation is this question is, certainly not directed to any. We'll open it to all, but I think it's particularly fitting as we think about the hurdles of rare disease drug development. I would be very interested to hear the perspective of the panel. Tim, I think you bring a unique perspective in that you were at the FDA, now you're private sector, right? So
we call it going to the dark side.
Going to the dark side with a good exit strategy.
With a good, come on, you do.
With a good exit strategy.
I won't admit to that.
And Katie, being at the FDA, you probably certainly have a perspective about that. And Heidi, I certainly know that you can lend some comments from the perch that you sit on at NORD.
Okay, so I'll just start to say that I think the biggest hurdle is that both sides, the regulators and the regulated, don't understand each other, okay? And there was a lot of things when I was the director over there, I'd say, well, they can just do a clinical study. They got preclinical data. Just go have them do a clinical study to get us some more data. We'll have no problem. I didn't understand what that meant. It means a big deal, but I was a regulator and I just didn't understand them. Now that I'm on the outside, I meet a lot of colleagues in the private sector who don't understand that the FDA actually is kind of there to help you. It makes their day. It can be miserable. Would you agree? It can sometimes be miserable being a federal employee. But you know what? The great thing about being a federal employee is you and you alone get to do this awesome stuff, like sign off on a drug. And if you're a doctor, you want to treat patients, you want to make them well with your signature, you can treat thousands or tens of thousands of people. It's very cool. So you get extra compensation that other doctors don't get. So people on the outside think, oh, they're obstreperous bureaucrats, but they're really not. They're really people who really want to make it happen for you because that's part of their compensation, part of what they like to do. So my biggest, what I think is the biggest obstacle is the two sides just don't get each other.
So I can't ever compete with Tim and all of his experience, but what I will say is that the Diagnostic Odyssey that a lot of rare disease patients go through way predates any conversations about clinical trials or treatment. They usually have a 5 to 7 year Diagnostic Odyssey, the time in which they are spent getting a misdiagnosis, getting inappropriate treatment, or suffering from sometimes really significant disease progression, which then, once they've gotten that accurate diagnosis, makes it even harder for them to participate participate in clinical trials to show a meaningful outcome. So I think getting these patients that are struggling with a rare disease an accurate diagnosis earlier so that they can be connected to a clinical trial network and a specialized provider that can help coordinate their care and give them the best chance for an optimal outcome is really critical.
Thanks. And I should have said this into my introduction, but just a quick disclaimer that anything I say, my opinions are my own and are not meant to represent agency views. So as an economist, I think a lot about de-risking in this space. And so to me, kind of one of the biggest hurdles is thinking about being able to create better predictive preclinical models, moving away from animal models and towards microphysiological systems like organ on a chip. And I know FDA is really feels very strongly about this. Office of Chief Scientist is one of their main priorities, coming up with our new chief scientist that just came in. And I think this is especially important for rare disease where there's a lot of heterogeneity within disease. Maybe we aren't exactly sure which mechanism is associated with which subtype, and so these predictive models are extremely important to reduce the risk, have fewer trials so that enrollment can be better in the trials that we do have, and then decreasing, hopefully, the cost through that de-risking.
I think one other thing that'd be worth pointing out, Del, is Amber is an amazing advocate for her child, for her community, and what she is going through and has gone through is replicated in hundreds of other patient advocacy organizations. NORD did a survey, and we're an umbrella group. We represent about 325 nonprofits. We represent all 7,000 known rare diseases. But when we surveyed our members, just a couple statistics that really stuck out to me. Out of the 137 that responded, half of them have no employees at all. They're entirely volunteer run. 97% of them talk about wanting to be involved in research and education. And 75% of them are either trying to work on a natural history registry or have one already in place. But the main thing to know, I think, is that half of these members have less than $500,000 in revenue. So they are struggling for funding and struggling to do that disease-specific advocacy that is so near and dear to their hearts. They oftentimes don't have Amber's tenacity. It's hard enough to be running an organization, period, but when you're also a caregiver for a child or a loved one with a rare disease, like, it takes an incredibly special person to be able to pull all of this together. And Amber is that advocate, and there are hundreds of thousands of other Ambers out there that are trying to make do with very little while being the best advocate that they can. And so their ability to have a partner in industry who's going to work with them closely and understand their needs, their desires, and their hope in these cures is really, really important.
Good perspective. I think the panel, as I mentioned, is particularly fitting. We're coming up on the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act here in January. We talk about the hurdles. What do we have to be excited about, going forward? What piques your interest or, gets your juices going when you think about, what's going right, what's on the horizon?
Oh, it's the technology. Mm-hmm. It's pretty friggin' awesome. It's gene therapies, it's the microbiome, it's all kinds of new stuff. If there's one thing to get really excited about, that's the core of it.
Yeah, I think that when the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983, we had 38 drugs for rare disease patients. We now have over almost 600 drugs that have been approved, and I checked this morning, there's 1,087 orphan indications that have an FDA-approved treatment. The Orphan Drug Act has worked, and there needs to be a real doubling down on it to protect it going forward. And I think we need to work on building the incredible technological advances that Tim referenced. The cost of genetic testing is going down. It needs to be more accessible to our community. If you're talking about 80% of patients having some type of genetic component to their disease, that's a key for diagnosis. It's a key for unlocking cures. We also have the ability now, as a result of COVID, to utilize more readily remote patient monitoring and decentralized clinical trials, as was discussed earlier, and telehealth to help get patients the right care before the right provider. And that's super exciting. I think the future for rare disease patients is really bright.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of echo my fellow panelists in saying I think the future of approvals is what's really exciting. And I have a little bit of data. All this is actually public on OOPD's website if you're interested in exploring more. But in the first decade of this century, so 2000 to 2009, OOPD designated 1,153 designations. And to date, those have yielded 217 approvals. In just the last 3 years, 2019 through 2021, we've designated 1,179 designations, and there's already been 28 approvals from that. So I just think going forward, this huge increase in approvals that we've seen in recent years, I'm just really excited to see how that translates into approvals.
And hundreds more in the pipeline, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Petrosky asked a question earlier, whether or not you think this is the golden age. I would argue that rare disease is in fact, arguably the next frontier, right? Thinking about, from a regulatory standpoint, some of the pathways that we have, oncology is considered to a large extent very successful. Certainly there's some uniqueness within oncology and the particular regulatory pathways set up within the FDA. But looking at that, what parallels perhaps could we draw, or what best practices or things that work with oncology could we extrapolate and think, maybe that works for rare, or maybe we could replicate for rare?
Well, first of all, there's always been this dualism in orphan drugs of cancer orphans and non-cancer orphans since the very beginning. Right now, probably they represent about 40% of all orphan drugs. I happen to be a pathologist by training, so I can tell you, if you look through the microscope, you can probably identify about 900 different kinds of cancers. Maybe only 10 of them are common, by the way. So that leaves you 890 or so that are rare. Most cancer types, not most cancer that occurs, but most types of cancer actually are rare. There's only, maybe a dozen or so that are common. I won't list them all, but you can probably figure them out. So cancer has always been a part of the orphan drug story since its very beginning up until now. The two of them have meshed very well. Right now, there's a lot of focus on separating it out and making a cancer center for excellence and bringing up some excellent, great new practices from which I do think we can learn. But the orphan drug story is we're eating FDA, okay? More than half of all drugs that are approved of new drugs are orphans right now. So back in 1983, I can tell you it was a bit of a stigma to be an orphan. Nobody wanted to be an orphan. There was no money for orphans. If you were an orphan drug, you were doomed in 1983. That's not the story today. Today, you're doomed if you don't have an orphan in your pipeline.
Let that be the case. You should. I think, I don't have a ton of FDA expertise. I actually come at this more from a coverage and reimbursement side of things, but I think that when you think about the investment that's been made in in verified biomarkers and surrogate endpoints that are somewhat disease agnostic, that's really helped move the oncology field forward and has set and provided some certainty to enable a robust set of approvals that we would love to see more done in a kind of disease agnostic way on rare disease to help give some of that certainty and some clear targets.
Katie, do you have a perspective? No, well, you do have experience, Heidi, in patient advocacy organizations. And Tim, I'd be interested to get your perspective on this too, thinking of how industry and the patient community can work with regulators to establish best practices or to, sufficiently represent.
So look, FDA loves to be responsive. That's their gig, okay? We pay them taxes, they do stuff for us. So if you got a disease and you got a company and you want to have a Part 15 meeting or you want to go talk about various endpoints in a sort of open listening session, they're there. People are afraid. There's way too much fear and loathing of the FDA out there, way too much. Those people do not bite, okay? They are your partners. You can't make a drug without them, and guess what? They can't make one without you either. So you gotta go knock on their door and say, hey, look, we got Prader Willi, and we want an index for a possible endpoint. Can we have a big meeting about it and just talk about it? Many, many different disease groups have done this, from Duchenne's to, you name them. Or she should rattle them off. Go ahead, your turn.
No, I mean, I don't think there's been a meeting that I've heard an FDA official speak that the mantra has not been come to us early and come to us often. And I think that that is something that as the patient community we need to take to heart, recognizing that so many of our patient advocate groups and organizations want to be a part of this process. And so there really needs to be a locking of hands and working closely with the FDA, and not only for industry members to come to the FDA early and often, but to come having worked already preemptively before that meeting with their patient advocacy partners, so that everyone is heading towards the same goal.
That's great. Tim, it's been a minute since you've been away from the FDA. It's been a minute.
Left in 2011, so it's been a decade and a year.
Yeah.
A year. So you want to know what's changed or what's different?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about one thing that nobody will talk about, but I'll talk about. There's this fellow there. You know him, Chip Startzman. He is the king of designations. He's been doing it for like 30 years or so. He's a very quiet guy. Very, very, very. He works in a dark office. He still keep his office dark? Probably, yeah.
Well,
Okay.
we're all at home now.
Nobody.
So I think he's in his kitchen.
He's terrified to do public speaking. I could never get him to go to Europe. That's too far. Anyways, he taught me how to do designations, taught me how to authorize and sign off on them. And I probably disagreed with him about maybe 5% of the time, maybe 3% of the time. He is the institutional memory, but you wouldn't know him because he's a very quiet guy. He's now about 70. He's about to retire. I wonder what that's going to imply. So that's one of the things that really concerns me going forward in terms of things that are changing. We're on the edge of that big change because the institutional memory of some of the people who came in with the original Orphan Drug Act, and that's not just, by the way, in the government, but it's also out in industry and it's also in patient groups, it's changing. Some people are aging out. Some people are actually old enough to now retire and have been here for the whole Orphan Drug Act. So I sometimes kid him and say he's as old as dirt, but he really is kind of, he's leaving and he's moving on, and that's, so the passage of time and changing of people. We've seen more lawyers come in to my old office, a lot more lawyers around than there used to be, that's for sure, so things are getting a little hairier on that side, but how about you? Any other questions on things that have changed in the last few, you wouldn't know, you just got here, right?
I mean, yeah, I was hanging out in Africa working on malaria for a long time. So before that, I was working on Capitol Hill. I think that in the very short time that I've been leading NORD's policy team, I think one of the big changes, and all of you can roll your eyes who've heard this already, but the 11th Circuit Court decision about how orphan drug exclusivity is going to be awarded is a sea change for the Orphan Drug Act. Previously, the orphan drug designation was orphan drug exclusivity was based on designation, and the 11th Circuit Court last fall ruled that it actually should be based on unclear language from the ODA from 1983, saying it should be based on designation. And I think from the patient community, that's a really alarming change, because for our community, knowing a drug is safe and effective for that very specific population is very important. And we want to see the incentives that were developed under the Orphan Drug Act, including that provision of orphan drug exclusivity, which, Tim, I would agree with. That turned out to be the most important aspect of the ODA in 1983, is adhered to. This has been FDA's long-standing policy to make that award specific to indication or use and not designation. And to see that upturned, and then the struggle to get that codified as part of this year's PDUFA process has been really, really frustrating from our end. And I think it has the potential to have really long-standing implications for the patient community.
Tim, I'm going to go back to you. You and I had a chance to catch up this morning and had a good conversation about expedited approval mechanisms and things of that sort. We talked about the accelerated approval. You have an interesting perspective. I asked you, around approval pathways for rare more generally, and how the accelerated approval pathway is so significant and meaningful for rare disease. I also mentioned this concept that we heard last week and Rini, I think it may have been you that mentioned flexible pathways, actually, in rare disease. I would like to hear your perspective on what could be strengthened in that regard for rare disease.
So yeah, one of the things I think we can share to the broader audience that you and I talked about this morning is that the FDA would claim that it always has tremendous flexibility, and it does. It has tremendous authority, tremendous flexibility. For those of you who are collecting answers to trivia questions, you may wonder, what is the fewest number of patients in clinical trials on which FDA has approved an orphan drug? And the answer is 4. So there was a drug for hereditary erotic aciduria that was approved about 7 or 8 years ago now. It was approved based on 4 patients observed in a clinical trial. And the FDA, it's public record as to how it made that decision, that it still met the substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness criteria for marketing authorization. So, and each of those 4 patients, by the way, had their own individual endpoint. That's one of the things we struggle with in rare diseases, right, is that there's this heterogeneous kind of expression of the same disease. So how do you have one endpoint for all of them when you've got different people doing different things? So FDA, in this particular instance, was able to do that. How were they able to do it? Well, you know, that's a qualitative measure. Substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness. You didn't hear any numbers, you didn't hear any p-values in that statement, but that's what FDA holds itself to. How many people would you have to throw out of an airplane with and without a parachute to know that parachutes have a substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness? You wouldn't, not too many. You would kind of know right off the bat. You would know right away. And in this particular instance, they also knew right off the bat. So FDA would claim, and I think that they have some reason to believe, some data to support that in this particular approval and in some other ones, that they already have tremendous latitude. They're not just rule book followers. They can approve drugs when they see it. Now, that introduces subjectivity, and sometimes you get a bad reviewer, and sometimes things that really are important get stuck. But I think that that's what FDA would claim, and I think that they have a claim to that claim.
Katie, along the same theme, in the same vein of that question, what do you think are the biggest opportunities, from on the FDA side?
Sure, so I'll speak to OPD. I think really the increasing interest in orphan drug designations, as my previous numbers kind of imply, and also rare pediatric disease designations. I think the increasing interest in those is something that's really an opportunity for our office, and we're hoping to do a lot of outreach around this. It's been 10 years since Creating Hope Act was passed. We're working on a manuscript to better inform people what those designations look like, and in anticipation of the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act, we're also creating a series of papers to hopefully provide some more information to people about what the designations have looked like and where the field is going. Also, I think legislation like Section 5 of the Act for ALS is a really big opportunity for our office. Section 5 is a specific section that OOPD is going to be administering, and it gives us just a lot of opportunities to collaborate with NIH, with patient groups, with other stakeholders to really facilitate product development for rare disease with like a regulatory perspective and regulatory input. So I think those kind of opportunities are really important for our office.
Following up on that question, what's your perspective on how industry, and Heidi, maybe you could opine here on the patient organization front, but what could industry and the patient community do to partner or enhance the dialogue with the FDA?
I'll start. I think there's a number of public-private partnerships that have been in development. There are things that are outlined in the PDUFA commitment letter. All of them involve the words rare disease, cures, accelerator. So we've got the ARC, the Accelerating Rare Disease Cures. We've got the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator data and analytics platform that NORD helps implement with CPATH in a public-private partnership with FDA. I think that they've got patient-focused drug development. I think that there is so many opportunities we can help clarify what do you need from the patient perspective to make sure that the evidence that's being generated is showing the impact that patients expect and want. And also just communicating early and often with the FDA so that everybody is going in with the same set of expectations. I think you end up, what we see is a lot of finger pointing of it's their fault, it's our fault, they didn't do this, we didn't do that. And I think going in, and NORD is a part of this, we help educate our member organizations around what does this look like, what does meaningful interaction with the FDA look like, and I think that that really needs to be deepened, but that also needs to be a part of the conversation between patient orgs and industry. Everyone needs to know the rules of the road and what they're aiming towards, and both sides need to be good actors in that space.
Yeah, I completely agree with Heidi. Communication is really key. I'd say for patient groups, making sure you're meeting with the FDA, either in patient listening sessions, patient-focused drug development meetings, and really knowing what your ask is for the FDA. We have a broad range of things that we do in drug development, but by all means, we don't do everything. We don't do pricing. There's a lot of things that we're not responsible for, so making sure your ask is really tailored to things that we can help with and we can accomplish with you. With industry, early and often, everybody, we all know this, but also making sure that you're interacting with the patient groups, working with them for enrollment, working with them to create endpoints. FDA really wants to see this, and making sure the patient voice is heard throughout the development process. And then I just say for both industry and patient groups, helping to increase the knowledge of the disease is so important, whether that's through natural history studies, whether that's through registries. Those are things that both patient groups and industry can do to really move drug development forward.
Kind of a follow-up question when you look at the FDA structure and its current form, I guess for Tim and Katie, looking at the EMA and the things that they do, particularly in the context of rare disease. Are there key learnings? Are there things that we could look across the pond, if you will, to use that term, and say, that might work, or we have gaps or deficits to fill, things that they're doing perhaps better, or ways that they're addressing the rare disease community more generally that we should be thinking about from a regulatory standpoint here in the United States?
Sure. So one of my last acts was as director of the Office of Orphan Products, was a very failed attempt to try to integrate the two designation systems. I mean, that was definitely pie in the sky and wasn't going to happen. But it was a nice try, and it was kind of fun to look at it, because if we could do anything together, orphan designation, it seemed to me, we certainly probably couldn't do marketing authorization, but I thought maybe we could do that, but no, and another decade has passed and nobody's talking about that. So that's probably not ever going to happen. As we look across the pond, there are a few things that we can see. One is that, hey, we're not doing so bad. We look at the number of designations they've had, the number of designations we've had, the numbers of approved drugs we've had. I'm one of those arrogant Americans. Yeah, okay, I am. But, and that's a good thing. So we have really got it right and done really well. Having said that, there are some things that they do really quite nicely. One is the big handoff from the COMP, the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products, to the CHMP through this process called Protocol Assistance. And it is excellent. It's a great way to transition people from the designation process into the review division kind of process, which, for us, we're kind of, I sometimes joke and say, the FDA, there is no such thing as the FDA. It's a loose confederation of offices that, we don't really talk to each other very much at all between the review division and OOPD. But we do sometimes, but, down in the cafeteria. But otherwise, not too much. So that is a nice thing that they do that's really great. That I think is another thing that they do is, just as Swiss trains run on time. Well, Switzerland's not part of the EU, but trains in Europe often run on time, and their designation process runs on time. It takes longer. It's about 7 months. Right now, we're running at about 3 months in OOPD, but sometimes we've been up to a year or over a year, and sometimes we're down to 1 month or 2 months. We never really know. It's always just at the back of the line. And so if it were a little bit more of a predictable system, they are very process-oriented people over there, and they do a really good job with that. So there are some things that we could learn from them, even though overall we've done real well.
Well, I just say that we did learn from them in creating our Orphan Drug Modernization Plan in 2017. We now do have the 90-day deadline for orphan drug designations, that we try and review them in 90 days. Sometimes things take longer because there's issues, but I think we do a pretty good job. So I'm on time with mine. I'll tell you that. I haven't missed a deadline.
You want Katie leading your review team, clearly.
Yeah.
At Alexion, we spent a lot of time talking about the rare disease ecosystem. If you could create, the perfect ecosystem for rare disease, what would that look like? Lots of facets to that. Thinking, as I'd mentioned, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act. There's been a lot of encroachments, right? A lot of, wanting to take away by way of R&D. But if you think about how the Orphan Drug Act specifically feeds into, there's a lot of elements that feeds into a rare disease ecosystem. How could we improve off incentives? How could we, looking 40 years out from now, if you had a perfect world, what improvements would you look to make from the Orphan Drug Act?
Well, I have one that I think could be operationalized, but I'm not sure exactly how. Drug repurposing is one of the things that the ODA doesn't actually address. If there's a drug that's out there for a common disease, there's some things about it. Number one, you know that it got approved by FDA, so it's not inert, okay? It actually is effective for something. Number two, you know that it's not poison, okay? You know that it's not toxic, and it keys into some biological system. Well, there are many examples, and when I was there as the director, I cross-linked the databases of the designation database to the Orange Book to see what have we got out here of drugs that are already approved. And we put out spreadsheets, and we called it the repurposing database for industry at the time. So it makes great science, and it makes for great medical sense. It's simple. People could just do just the clinical trial. They leapfrog over all that early stage development, and they just have to go and test it in the rare disease. The problem is, it makes no business sense at all, because usually that product is already out on the market, it's highly genericized, the prices are cheap, and the big advantage of the Orphan Drug Act is that you charge high prices, right? So it makes perfect scientific sense and medical sense, but not any business sense. We need an incentive for repurposing. If I were to rewrite the Orphan Drug Act, I would try to come up with something. I'm not sure I have that answer right now, but that's one thing that is sorely lacking, and going forward, an incentive for repurposing would be fantastic.
I think that the Orphan Drug Act has been tremendously successful. And in my conversations on Capitol Hill, I don't think there's anyone who disagrees with that. But what I do hear more often is, it's almost been too successful. Like these drugs are high cost oftentimes, and they're increasingly a significant percentage of the Medicare drug spend. They're increasingly a significant percentage of each state's Medicaid program's drug spend. And so I think we are in a period of defense on the ODA, and I think that we need to be out there telling the story of why it has been so incredibly successful. And I would love to be pie in the sky and say that there's going to be a huge opportunity for increased incentives. I'm kind of a realist, and maybe that's a cynic, but I think we're going to be in a defensive posture. And so to Chris's point earlier, telling the story of why this has helped your companies make the business decisions that you have and the cures that you're driving because of those opportunities and those incentives is going to be really important in this environment. We now have a world where nearly every Republican who was here in 2017 has voted to cut the orphan drug tax credit. We have a world where every Democrat who was here in the House last fall has now voted to cut the orphan drug tax credit. So this is a clear incentive that we are going to be on defense on, and it's just one aspect of it. A more positive tone, I will say, is while I hear, oh wow, that Orphan Drug Act was so successful, was it too successful? I hear we've done so much on the FDA side, we need to do more on the access side. And for rare disease patients, getting that FDA-approved treatment is huge. It unlocks the next step to getting coverage and getting that care that you need to get that optimal health outcome. So we should be thinking about the ways that we can show the value of these products to patients and ensure that the FDA approval is not just a step in the road, but that it quickly leads to coverage in a more robust way. Because these patients having access to a cure, knowing it's FDA approved, and then having to fight with their insurance company for months or years to get access to these products is devastating. And so I think there's a real interest, and you see it in the Cures 2.0 legislative effort that is being led by Representatives DeGette and Upton to bring that 21st century complementary cures piece up to speed on the access side. And I think that making the case for why that'll make a huge difference in rare is our next challenge for the next Congress. And opportunity, challenge and opportunity.
Yeah, so obviously I can't speak to any specific reforms, but just as in my personal opinion as an economist approaching this question, I think that having really specific and targeted incentives sometimes works best. We think about first, like, what is the goal? Is the goal to get a cure for a particular disease? And then what are the specific obstacles that are impeding that goal? Tailoring the incentives to those specific obstacles is always going to work better than having just a much broader, you know, I don't want to say throwing money at the problem, but just putting a non-targeted incentive out there. And to remember that, you know, money isn't always the answer. There may be obstacles that have to do with legal framework, and maybe tort reform is what's necessary and not a prize. And thinking about, you know, are the obstacles early in the development process, or are they later in the development process as an access issue? And really working through those obstacles so that you can create targeted incentives.
So kind of open question before we maybe move into taking some questions from the audience. We've heard numbers thrown out there, 7,000 diseases. Recent data would suggest upwards to 10,000, maybe 11,000. We've heard numbers, 90% of these rare diseases don't have treatments, might be 95%, quite frankly, if you look at some of the other data. What's the biggest thing, from your perspective, each of you, that we could do to close that gap? You talked about repurposing that kind of maybe patches up a subset of those rare diseases. We talk about the Orphan Drug Act. That goes so far, but we still have thousands, and the vast majority are truly unmet by way of treatments. And so do you have a perspective on what we could do? It could be from a regulatory standpoint, Heidi. It could be from a different lens, from the view that you see things. And Katie, I welcome it from the FDA perspective as well.
Well, catalyst is the word that hasn't been spoken yet this morning.
I didn't
although
say it, and I thought that was really good.
It was obliquely sort of the elephant in the room. So I'm going to say, hey, there's that elephant. This is the court decision that came in 2021 that said, exclusivity is going to be based on the designation, which is usually like the whole disease, not on what the review division says, these are the people you can give it to, which is a totally different way from when I was there, or from the way it was done 2 years ago, for that matter. So it is changing things up a lot. There are lots of problems with that, and there are lots of things that can happen from that. There's no question. However, I will put forward the heretical position that it may be part of the solution to this problem that we've only got 10% of all rare diseases or have anything at all, because then exclusivity is going to cover the whole disease. And we do have a system, industry-wise, where somebody goes out, makes a bucket of money, and somebody else looks and sees, oh, how can I get a slice of that pie? And comes in and does something and replicates. And so much of our activity right now, if you look at those 1,100 almost approved orphan drugs, you see lots of replication. There's 1,100 approved orphan drugs, but what? They might treat, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 diseases. There's a smaller number of diseases that are actually treated. So if you're locked out, maybe you'll actually go into the wild, wild west of all these diseases that ain't got nothing yet. So that might be one of the silver linings should Catalyst end up staying.
I'm going to disagree.
You should. I knew you would.
There we go.
I knew you would.
Yeah, I think.
We need a little disagreement.
Yeah, no, and I think that good minds can think differently about this issue, and I fully respect Tim's perspective, but I think from the patient perspective, we know that our patients have easier access to products that are safe and effective for their specific condition. So if you have a broad designation that has blocked out exclusivity for a significant disease, but it's not specific to your genetic variation or your population, that often becomes off-label, and then you just have another fight with your insurance company to get that product covered. Also, it doesn't leave any incentives for companies to continue to study a product that has been proven to be safe, has been proven to be effective, and might come to market faster for that subsequent patient population. And I would argue that rather than going based on designation, we should be increasing the pot of funding that's going towards rare diseases in general. And so we see this Cancer Moonshot initiative that's through the administration. We see an effort around ARPA-H. We need to show the value of bringing rare diseases to that higher level moonshot discussion, but also integrating it into these new and exciting initiatives like ARPA-H, so that we are working with the existing incentives that the Orphan Drug Act provided, but we are continuing to drive new innovations that can have a really widespread impact across a lot of different, of these 7,000 to 10,000 rare diseases.
Yeah, so how do we get treatments for the rest of these 90%? I would kind of harken back to my previous statement about creating better predictive preclinical models. Most designations, the scientific rationale that comes in is based on in vivo data, the vast majority. And I think there's a reason why we have thousands of designations, but only hundreds of approvals. My other note would just be to highlight our grants program for everybody in the audience. We have a clinical trial grants program and also a natural history grants program. They are not just open to academics, they're also open to industry. They are open to patient groups who can put together a team that could receive the grants. That's happened in the past. And we see a lot of our industry grantees use that funding, leverage that funding into other types of funding.
Really outstanding commentary. Thank you, everyone. I'm sure there's a question or two in the audience along the lines of the things we've been discussing. Lisa?
If you've been tracking PDUFA and there's a deal, please shout out now. I'm very much interested.
Which one? You over there first?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, the mic's there in the spirit of efficiency.
Hi, everybody. Lisa Nelson with Amrit Pharma. Thank you for the great, insightful panel. I was wondering, Heidi, you mentioned a number of the activities that are really meant at the agency to accelerate rare cures. And I was wondering, Katie, if you could speak a little bit to ARC. ARC got announced, I think it was back in May, and just the work, and Heidi, maybe you know as well, what's underway at CDER? This issue of coordination across the agency for rare diseases has always been of significant interest, and would just love to hear some of the activities that are going on to start to support more of that coordination.
Sure. Actually, Heidi might know better. The ARC program is centered in CDER, in their rare disease program, and so I'm much less involved in that. But I'll defer to you, but also I'd be happy to answer any specific questions if you want to send me an email. I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited about the ARC program. I think that the desire to coordinate across different aspects of CDER is really of value. I think that we're looking forward to seeing some more of the outputs. I think there's some stuff that's in development, but hasn't been announced yet. We keep getting hints of that, and so we're also sort of anxiously awaiting what that actually looks like in terms of operationalizing this initiative. I think that, yeah, I'll just say that.
Yeah.
All right, second Lisa from Alexion. So when Dell asked you all what you were excited about, and Tim said technology, Heidi said reaping the reward of 40 years of ODA, Katie said more approvals. And just picking up on something else that Heidi said, we are at a point where approval does not mean access anymore. And one of the major drivers of that is a misaligned evidentiary standard between regulators and maybe the outside world, payers being one of them. So Tim, you mentioned that there was one trial that was 4 patients in a clinical trial, and that's great for a patient. And it's great for our system because it's relying on experts at the FDA that deem it safe and effective or efficacious. But on the payer side, that may be seen as experimental, or there may be issues with the trial criteria. So my question is, what are some policy solutions? What should we be pushing for to ensure that patients have access to the treatments at the right time? And perhaps it's a data issue, but perhaps it's something else. And my second question is, Katie, after this, maybe we can talk about organoids as a in vivo or in vitro preclinical model, because I just like saying organoids.
I mean, I would argue it all comes out of good evidence generation. FDA approval, Nord's perspective is you need to have that high substantial evidence of efficacy standard upheld, because that's what we turn around and argue to every insurance company that denies the claim for one of our patients. It's what we argue when we go to state Medicaid programs and say accelerated approval drugs are not actually experimental. They're not unproven. They have been deemed by the FDA to be safe and effective. You should cover them. Oregon Health Authority, whose Medicaid waiver is up for consideration next week. So just putting in a plug there. I think that furthermore, once this good data is generated, it is approved by the FDA, going back and incorporating that into standards of care and showing that efficacy so that state Medicaid P&T boards and DERBs and individual insurers understand that this is now part of the standard of care, and you're going to see increased and better health outcomes and ideally cost savings associated with that too. And so it is such an important part. Getting that FDA approval is is a midpoint in a very long patient journey, but it is not the end of that. That's a midpoint. I said endpoint. It's a midpoint in that patient journey, and they've got to be able to get access to that treatment. And so that takes all of us working together to make sure that that environment also exists. So things like upholding the standards of the Medicaid prescription drug rebate program and requiring that all Medicaid patients have access to FDA-approved therapies. Really, really important. And these little chipping away at those policies that have protected patients over the years is really alarming. And I think that it starts with the FDA's gold standard of this drug being safe and effective, being upheld, and that's where we start when we have these conversations on the coverage and access side.
Interesting. And we haven't even talked about health equity in the context of rare as an underserved population. Yeah, very important. Any other questions from the audience?
Felicia Brannon, Marilyn Ware. I
Good to see
think
you.
we've had the pleasure of being each other's company in the past. You talked about best practices. And so to Heidi, you and some of the others, best practices in terms of what you just said, Heidi, about chipping away at access to care services for the rare disease community. And so I've mentioned this in the past in the form of a comprehensive care model. So trained physicians, and that includes healthcare providers, as well as the policymakers who are making the decisions. Someone brought up the issue of risk. So when I heard about financial risk, it has to do with CMS, Medicare and Medicaid, and how they see the rare disease patient, because it's very costly to take care of us. So when I'm a rare disease patient, by the way. I got 3 of them running around in here. So when they are seeing us as a problem, if you will, and the cost of care for us, if everybody's educated about what that looks like. And I was excited to see the role of Nord in the ODA, if you will, 40 years ago, so thank you very much. If they're educated about what it looks like, then I think we become less of a risk when you're talking about the successes and everybody's all on the same page. Could that not be a way, through a comprehensive care model, if you will, of saying, we've seen a great success, here's a better way to approach it through policy, training physicians, et cetera, to cut down on the diagnostic journey and some of the other obstacles that we've all seen along the way. I mean, I think the mother, Amanda, is that correct? And talking about how everybody could benefit from all of this. Is that not a way to go about it?
I mean, absolutely. I think data drives the discussion and drives policy these days, and therefore showing what you can do with the right interventions at the right time, the right care model is really important. I think we've talked about this a little bit, but there's a pilot that was done in California on genetic testing, and it provided rapid whole genome sequencing to NICU babies who were Medicaid eligible in California. It's called Project Baby Bear, and they found that by giving those patients free access essentially to rapid whole genome sequencing. They saved $2.5 million. And those patients got the right diagnosis. They were able to connect with the right care provider. There might not have been a treatment available, but they weren't wasting their time, their mental health resources, and their money spinning their wheels trying to figure out what was wrong with their very small infant child in a NICU. And that's a win across the board, but those examples are fewer and far between in the rare space because we are rare, and it's a highly tailored, highly specific outcome, diagnostic journey, treatment plan. And so we need these stories, and oftentimes that's the patient community has them, and industry partners have them. And we, as patient advocates, need that information so we can make the case for why this comprehensive care, it saves money, ultimately, for policymakers who are concerned with that, but at the end of the day, it leads to better outcomes for our patients, and that's what NORD's concerned about.
I think that's a great point. I think when you look at the Diagnostic Odyssey and you talk about comprehensive care, you look at the rare disease patient more generally, and that journey, as we all know, as you know, as I know as a caretaker myself on the personal side, it's years and years and years, right, of tests, hospital visits, sometimes hospitalization. You speak to diagnostics and how that plays into kind of curbing that diagnostic journey and just all around care. 7 specialists, right? I mean, think about it if we had a comprehensive care model for the rare disease community. You touched on cost. Rare disease therapies are more expensive, and I'm opining just on my perspective here because I have an opinion on this, but we also need to address the systemic issues within our health financing system that can sustain the innovation, the surge of innovation that is coming by way of rare disease therapies, but a sustainable model that can actually pay for them. Cell and gene therapies are only one part of the equation. There's sometimes one-time curative therapies. We're talking about rare disease patients that are on chronic therapies and sometimes in perpetuity. We need a different model, and that's another element that needs to be addressed too. Okay, I think with that we'll conclude. Thanks again to the panelists. A great panel.
Thank you very much.